Hello, beautiful community. Let's look at the mega leak that came out almost a week ago now, and just do a couple of things in this brief conversation. Ground ourselves a little bit about it emotionally, in case some of you are freaking out a bit, and then just explore some of the political repercussions, particularly around discourse about Western support for Ukraine in the West. And all of the intelligence based analysis and all of the military analysis we're going to leave largely out, except just looking at it in terms of broad brushstrokes. So we will say a little bit about what comes out there about the Ukrainian military, and we'll say something about discourse about support in Ukraine in the West. But I want to put aside the fact that this is one of the biggest leaks of its kind this century, and the fact that there are good questions to ask about why this happens and whether the United States has special vulnerabilities around keeping its secrets that it needs to do better with. And there are interesting conversations about how when this stuff comes out, it can't be put in the hands of the right people because it's forbidden information. They refuse to analyze it. So we don't always get the best analysis of what this means. And we're certainly going to put aside specific conversations about who and how this might damage. But let's ground ourselves first a bit emotionally, and then we'll look at the level of discourse what this does for Western talk about supporting Ukraine. And my recommendation is not to panic on that one. I just think that when you see stuff like this, especially if you are not sort of, directly involved with politics, or you don't study politics, or you don't even follow politics with great closeness. And I know that many of you do follow politics closely, but I still think even for you, there can be a kind of reaction of so much darkness there, first of all. And secondly, so much opacity. And the darkness is that, that the United States is spying on its allies, nobody trusts anyone, and the United States is pressurizing allies to do things they don't want to do. The Wagner group is trying to get weapons allegedly from Turkey via Mali. The Chinese are kind of not looking like they're going to give weapons to Russia, but some people allegedly think they might if too many attacks happen on Russian territory with NATO weapons. This looks like a mess. It just looks dark. It looks like even the least worst agents on the global scene are immersed in complex alliances and complex machinations. And, and this politics is the kind of art where ethical considerations sometimes come in, but mostly they vanish. So, and that's inevitable, and there is no way to transcend that. And we have to acknowledge the darkness of big politics, while also recognizing that politics has done extraordinary things, right? The invention of the modern democratic republic, which is roughly the kind of society most of you live in, is a freak occurrence in terms of its remarkably beneficial consequences. Human beings have done amazing things with politics and terrible things and everything in the middle. Our relations, when they're not direct, when they're mediated by very complex institutions we share or don't share, get really dark and scary if we have the prejudice that they should be modeled on the kind of ethical adequacy we would expect from ourselves in personal life. So darkness, but then opacity. And it always gives people this kind of strange feeling like, well, how far can a society exist that is transparent with itself about what it's doing, right? I mean, there's going to be some secrets, some lies, some opacity, but where's the balance? And can we have the sort of thing we talk about on this channel, which is faith in a democratic society that is tethered to the practiced value of truthfulness? Doesn't mean there isn't going to be some opacity and deception there too, but that broadly is tethered to the practiced value of truthfulness. Is that a pipe dream? Is that real? And so on. And I want to just read you before jumping to more practical considerations about support for Ukraine and our sense of Ukraine's military, the political meaning of that. Just before jumping to that, I want to read you just 3 or 4 lines from the most important book of social philosophy written in the 21st century that I can't recommend actually, because 2 or 3 of the chapters are quite accessible, but 2 or 3 of the chapters are also so inaccessible that most professional philosophers can't understand them. And they're not inaccessible through not being clear, they're crystal clear. They're just difficult. So this is a book called Truth and Truthfulness by Bernard Williams, written in 2002. Bernard was sick and he would have written it a bit differently if he'd lived longer. It is not foolish to believe that any social and political order which effectively uses power and which sustains a culture that means something to the people who live in it must involve opacity, mystification, and large-scale deception. Reasonable people can believe, contrary to the ideals of liberalism, and liberalism isn't meant in the American sense, it's just meant in the sense of the modern democratic republic, elections, independent institutions, and so on. It doesn't mean anything left or right. Reasonable people can believe, contrary to the ideals of liberalism, that human beings cannot live together effectively, at least on any culturally ambitious scale, if they understand fully what they're doing. It is not necessarily foolish to believe these things, but they may not be true, and we can still live in the hope that they're not. And so what is Bernard saying when he's essentially saying in his own words that it's possible to have a society, that we can have a truthful hope about building a society, sustaining a society that is tethered to the practice virtue of truthfulness? Well, what he means is that whether that's possible or not isn't a philosophical question. It's rather, can humans, under the conditions that they find themselves under, which are different in each historical period, so can we, in our historical conditions, with all the things that are happening to our societies, all the ways our societies are being pulled apart, for example, that we sometimes talk about, can we, under these conditions, make it work? And that's a practical question, actually. That's a practical question. And so the answer ain't an answer any philosopher can give. The answer is, what are we going to be able to do in practice? Can we build this? Can we keep it going? So that's very important. And I always recommend a hopeful answer there. But a hopeful answer still given with eyes wide open. So let's look a little bit about at Ukraine support discourse. I made a note of some of the things that I've come across on the side of folks who don't want to support Ukraine. So this is stuff I've gleaned from discussions of the leaks from people who want to reduce Western support for Ukraine on the in the North American and the European informational space. Now, I just want to say something, that when we're talking about reasonable discussions, we always have to recognize that we can't conflate what's a reasonable sort of circle of allowable discussion with what we believe to be right? So obviously the argument that we should stop supporting Ukraine is a reasonable political argument to make. And if that feels uncomfortable for you, then something it needs to be explored around how you understand the permissible range of how a society talks to itself. I think folks who are over 50 struggle less with this, but younger people are very much at risk, particularly in the United States and in the UK too, of conflating what they think is right with what they think should be allowed as part of our public discourse. And my recommendation is, if you're 25 years old, what is reasonable discourse is what you're comfortable with. So that edge where you're beginning to feel a little bit uncomfortable, ooh, I don't like this being said, find that place, and then 3 or 4 steps beyond it is typically where the parameters of reasonable discourse lie. So, I mean, the basic story is, we are pumping, critics of support in Ukraine say, we're pumping billions into a stalemate, and our billions will influence the stalemate in Ukraine's favor. But really, is that what we want to do? Plus, we're risking escalation and World War III. That's basically the sort of the catch-all of that critique. But the specific things that have come out that are interesting. I think a lot of people have tagged on to what we just mentioned earlier about how we're spying on our allies and so on. And they've tagged on to the idea that Ukraine genuinely seems to be, for them, a worryingly independent actor, that they're supported and propped up by the United States, but not really controlled by the United States, and often doing things the United States doesn't like or doesn't see through. And so we've often heard the argument, we don't trust Ukraine enough, and this is what these leaks reveal. They're too much of an independent actor. Our interests and their interests diverge, which is obviously true, but the question is where? Right? So that's been a very important sort of thrust that has been recurring. I think another thrust has been that Zelensky wants longer-range missiles. And that's in a way a strange one, because that's been public knowledge, in my opinion. But people have reacted to it as though it wasn't, and as though this really establishes it as public knowledge. And that has been problematic, really. That's problematic, people feel, because it just risks significant escalation. And that debate about Ukraine wanting longer-range missiles is tied to the thought that ultimately Ukraine's aim is to bring NATO directly into the war. And actually that's true. It is Ukraine's aim to bring NATO into the war. They would love that. And that is not in the interest of any Western country, obviously. And that's been taken as a very alarming fact indeed. Sometimes exploitatively so, and sometimes by people who are genuinely worried about this. Whereas one of the things that's been very striking about Western policy, I believe, is actually how rigorous, particularly the United States has been around escalation management and around boundaries about what kinds of risks are posed by which kinds of actions. Right? Now, I don't make weapons or recommendations on this channel, but my presumption would be in favor of giving Ukraine longer distance weapons. So how damaging is all of this? In other words, is this just the same argument, the same set of arguments being made over and over and over and over, and sort of the balance of the public spaces remain the same? This has just been an excuse to just fuel the underlying narratives. Anyway, they would have been there without it. No, I do think that this has done some damage to the cause of support in Ukraine, but I would say that my feeling about it, certainly in terms of the US information environment, is that this is bad to kind of bad, not very bad and not terrible. I don't think this is going to dramatically subvert the balance of public discourse in the United States about it. So I basically recommend us to not freak out that this is a game changer in terms of how the West talks to itself about supporting Ukraine. The next thing is the Ukrainian military. And we're putting aside the Russian military that suffered shocking losses, is beset by various kinds of extravagant incompetence. We're not going to talk about that. In terms of where Ukraine's at, I don't see what's surprising in this picture. I think that the picture that comes out of the leaks is surprising if you've been one of those gung-ho Ukraine people who've been gung-ho without a tether to the reality that Ukraine's going to, win, and there is no doubt about that. Well, then maybe, but that there's never been any evidence that that's true. So I don't think that there's anything surprising about the fact that we're getting a picture of a Ukrainian military that is short, depleted, exhausted. That's inevitable. The trouble is that partly that's a bug. In other words, partly that is because the West hasn't been able to do more of what it's open to doing. It's not had enough to give. It's not had enough to give quickly enough, and so on. But partly it's not a bug, it's a feature of the kind of policy we've been discussing, the policy of strengthening Ukraine, supporting Ukraine, enough to get them to potentially be in a better position, possibly after the offensive that may come soon, counteroffensive. But a better position of what kind? Well, maybe just a better position, and whatever that means, that means. That might mean Ukraine being in a stronger position for negotiation. That might mean Ukraine winning and taking Crimea, but that could be something that just happens for reasons we can't entirely foresee. But that's not something that's not an outcome we are driving toward with our policy, right? So the picture of the Ukrainian military you're seeing is partly a product of the fact that the West is committed to Ukraine's sustenance, survival, independence. It's not committed to a full Ukrainian victory. It's open to that, but it's not committed to it. And so the fact that Ukraine needs much more support, right, is partly a bug, but partly a feature of Western policy. And so if one understood that, one would not be surprised by where we're at. And that's basically my commentary on it. It's if it's a bit pessimistic, it's not surprisingly pessimistic, and it just leads us back to the conclusion that this is going to be decided on the battlefield, and the proposals for negotiation now that come out of various different camps that are saying let's stop pumping money into a stalemate. These proposals aren't either realistic or justified, or they're neither wise nor are they practicably applicable. Ukraine needs to get as much territory back as it possibly can, and it will do that. And not doing that is basically creating a situation where Mr. Putin is going to take a break and then restart the war again from a potentially stronger position. You can see, obviously, my recommendation here, which is for Western policy to be closer than it is today toward siding with a Ukrainian victory rather than Ukrainian survival. But that's what we're at for now, and so much will be decided by what happens over the weeks and months to come in the field of battle. Lots of love for the moment.